Let's be honest, the conversation around AI in the art world is, well, it's a complete mess, right? It's so emotional. Every single time we try to talk about these new tools, it just spirals into this tangled knot of fear and excitement and a whole lot of anger. And frankly, it's not getting us anywhere.
This quote right here, it just nails the problem perfectly. We're taking all these huge, separate, complicated issues, like economic harm, what authorship even means, ethics, and we're cramming them all into one simple emotional reaction. A big thumbs up or a big thumbs down on AI as a whole. This is what's called a category error, and it's the very reason this entire conversation is just stuck.
So this whole explainer is about untangling that mess. Because lumping everything together isn't just unproductive, it's actively stopping us from finding real solutions that could actually help people. To move forward, we have to pull these threads apart and look at each one clearly, on its own terms.
So let's start with the most immediate and honestly the most painful part of this whole debate, the very real, very tangible harm that a lot of artists are genuinely afraid of. This isn't some abstract idea. We're talking about people's livelihoods.
And look, these fears are 100% valid. People are already using AI to undercut commissions and drive down prices. Big corporations are absolutely looking at this technology as a way to replace human artists and slash their creative budgets. The market is getting flooded with AI content, which can devalue the incredible skill and time that professional work requires, especially when social media platforms seem to reward just churning out content at a massive scale, not the actual craft. These are serious economic problems, and they need our full attention.
And this slide, this is the critical distinction we need to make. Over on one side, you've got concrete economic problems like market saturation and job displacement. On the other, you've got these big, abstract, philosophical questions like, what is art? The key takeaway is simple. You can't solve an economic problem with a philosophical answer. Worried about job displacement? You need economic solutions like new regulations or different kinds of revenue models, not a 3-hour debate on the definition of an author.
Okay, so speaking of those big philosophical questions, let's tackle one of the biggest, authorship. This is a huge, huge sticking point for a lot of critics. The argument usually boils down to this one core idea, that using AI removes the human from the creative driver's seat.
This is the claim you hear over and over again. And it seems pretty simple, doesn't it? If a person didn't manually draw every line or compose every note, then they can't possibly be the author. But let's actually test that logic for a second. If we really accept that idea, that using a powerful tool automatically cancels out human authorship, then we're going to run into some pretty major problems with a whole lot of creative work that we already accept and celebrate. I mean, a camera is a machine that produces an output, right? Does that mean a legendary photographer wasn't the author of their photos? Of course not. Nobody would argue that. Or what about a musician who uses a super complex synthesizer or a piece of software to score an entire film? We don't for a second deny that they are the author of that music. In this example, even outside the art world really drives the point home. A NASA engineer uses incredibly powerful computer simulations to design a spacecraft. The computer does the heavy lifting, the complex math, but we never ever question that the engineer is the author of that final design. And that's because we all kind of instinctively understand this principle. Authorship isn't about the raw manual labor of execution. It's about the human mind driving the whole process. It's about the intent, the creative choices, the constraints you apply, the critical judgment you use to select what works and throw out what doesn't. And ultimately, it's about taking responsibility for the final piece. The tool doesn't provide the meaning, the human does. And just quickly on the training data, a common argument you hear is that it's just plain unethical for an AI to learn from existing art. But every single human artist who has ever lived learns by studying and absorbing influences. The real ethical problem isn't the learning, it's the extractive deployment of that learning. When companies train models on artists' work without their consent, displace those same artists without any compensation, and basically just extract value without giving anything back to the creative ecosystem, that's not a learning problem, that's a governance problem. So if these core arguments against the tool itself are kind of shaky, what about the solution that a lot of critics propose, which is basically just don't use it, reject it entirely? Well, let's take a look at why that approach, even though it's emotionally appealing, has a really, really bad track record. History shows us that this is a really familiar pattern. When photography first showed up, painters called it a mechanical trick, said it was not real art.
When hip-hop artists started sampling records in the 80s, the industry screamed theft. The music business fought tooth and nail against digital distribution for years. And in every single one of those cases, the technology didn't go away. Banning it failed, and eventually new rules and new cultural norms had to be built around it. The debate today is really just the latest chapter in a very old book.
And the simple reality is that trying to prohibit this stuff is even less practical today. The technology is already out in the world. It's decentralized thanks to open source models. You cannot put this genie back in the bottle. Trying to ban it at this point is like trying to ban the internet. So if we can't get rid of it, and if the main philosophical arguments for banning it are pretty flawed, where does that leave us? Well, it means we need to stop arguing and start asking a much, much better question. We have to stop asking this question. Should AI exist in art? It's a dead end. Reality has already answered for us. It's here. Debating whether it should exist at all is a total waste of the energy we desperately need to solve the real problems.
The real, the productive, and frankly, the only question that actually matters now is this one. How do we build systems and norms and regulations around this technology to protect artists, to preserve human creativity, and to address those very real economic harms we talked about at the beginning?
And this isn't just some wishful thinking. There are concrete, practical steps we can take. Things like creating clear labeling and disclosure norms so we all know when AI is being used. We can establish licensing frameworks that let artists opt out or, better yet, get paid. We can build attribution directly into the DNA of the files themselves. We can develop new revenue-sharing models. And just as importantly, we as a culture can learn to make a strong distinction between low-effort AI slop and truly human-authored work that just happens to use AI as one of its tools. These are all solvable problems.
So here's the bottom line. We don't protect the future of art by pretending we can just refuse to use a new tool. We save it by building a world that insists on and rewards human agency. It's all about focusing on the intent, the judgment, and the vision that only a human being can bring to the table, no matter what tool they use to bring that vision to life. That is the conversation we need to be having right now.